Okay, thanks, Jessica. And hopefully everybody can see the slides, and we have that set up. So anybody send me your little checkbox or whatever, make sure you can see it. Okay, good. Get enough of them so you can, hopefully it's working. And so what Dan and Randy and I wanted to talk about today was some general concepts about carbon cycling in forest ecosystems, perhaps a bit more general than the specifics dealing with PINEMAP and loblolly pine, but I think what you'll find is they're applicable to what we're doing in PINEMAP. And so I'm starting off with a bit of a discussion of the carbon that is contained in soils. And what I'm talking about is the information that was presented in the paper by Schmidt that I asked everybody to read. And as we mentioned a little bit last week, the concepts presented in the paper by Schmidt are interesting because it's a kind of a new theory, a new evolution of our thought process on how carbon is sequestered in soils. And so it's a kind of an interesting time that we're working in that a theory that had been essentially in vogue for maybe 30, 40 years is now being revised as we've done more work in looking at soil carbon. And so I wanted to kind of walk you through this a little bit and how that is going to affect perhaps our interpretation of the results that we get and the implications that it might have for how climate change could alter processes in the soil. So let's start out with just the global carbon cycle, which is the picture you have. And so you've got a very traditional model, if you will, of the global carbon cycle with the pools, which is the accumulated amount of carbon represented in the dark blue. So if you're looking at the graph, you can see fossil fuels, they estimate 4,000, and these are picograms, which is a unit that I struggle with, and Dan's going to actually go through that unit a little bit for you, but it's actually 10 to the 15th gram is a picogram, and so that's a massive quantity, but we do it in picograms, so we just don't have that many zeros to follow. But you can see even when we're dealing with picograms, there's an awful lot of zeros when you look at like the total amount of carbon in the Earth's crust, which is 100 million picograms. And the red arrows that are on there represents estimates of the fluxes, which is the transfer from one pool to another. And so, you know, if you look at the top, you can see photosynthesis on an annual basis. The photosynthesis fixes about 120 picograms of carbon per year in green plants. Burning of fossil fuels, you know, it's about 6 picograms. So you get some scale for those sort of things with it. You can also see pretty clearly in terms of pool sizes what the relative pools are, and that plants, you know, total contain, you know, 550, 560 picograms, atmosphere about 750, but the soils themselves are perhaps double or triple what's contained in the plants or the atmosphere. So in terrestrial ecosystems, when we're thinking about carbon sequestration, those soil pools become very important. Of course, they pale in comparison to the geologic pools that we have with fossil fuels or the Earth's crust or even the deep ocean. And so as we understand carbon cycles, those become very important to us. But from the PINEMAP standpoint, where we're dealing with terrestrial forest ecosystems, we're really interested in that plant and soil component, and that's why soils are so important. If I move to the next slide, I think it's it's important that we recognize two forms of carbon that we have to deal with. We have to recognize that there's inorganic carbon that we're dealing with and organic carbon that we're dealing with when we're talking about the global carbon cycle. And actually, inorganic carbon is a larger component of the carbon cycle on Earth, but it's one that we don't really manipulate in forest ecosystems as much. So let's take a look real quick at those two, just to give you a flavor for that. And so the inorganic carbon process really is the CO2-based carbon process. So CO2 is an inorganic molecule of carbon. And it is a reactive molecule, as illustrated in slide 3 or slide 4 that we're on now. And the best example is that of carbonate equilibrium. And so CO2 is a gas, and it will dissolve in an aqueous solution like water. And anybody that has drank a carbonated beverage is experiencing the CO2 that is soluble in that beverage. So if you shake up your beer or shake up your soda and release the pressure, you get it fizzing out. That's CO2 that had been dissolved in the liquid that's being released. And if you take a glass and you don't shake it, but you just sit it and you pour your soda in, you'll see the bubbles rising, which are, again, the CO2 coming off and reaching equilibrium, essentially, between the aqueous solution and the atmosphere. And so in your closed bottle, that CO2 is actually at a higher partial pressure and is greater partial pressure than the CO2 in the atmosphere, which is why it releases the CO2 when you take the top off. And as you go through, one of the key processes to inorganic carbon is the carbonate equilibrium. So the CO2 that dissolves in water reacts with the water molecules to form a weak acid that we call carbonic acid, H2CO3. That carbonic acid, as a weak acid, dissociates, so the hydrogen atom comes off, and you're left with hydrogen atoms and a bicarbonate atom, HCO3, which imparts some mild acidity to CO2, and then that will further dissociate to the carbonate atom, CO3, and the hydrogen, and again, releasing more. So we often hear of rainfall being slightly acidic under normal circumstances, and that's because CO2 dissolves in rainwater. This carbonate equilibrium process goes through, and you end up with some hydrogen ions released, which makes rainwater slightly acidic. Certainly acid rain, where you dissolve nitric acid and stronger acids, makes rainwater even more acidic. And this carbonate equilibrium process is really important in the oceans and is driving much of the CO2 sequestration in oceans as CO2 exchanges in. This graph I have shows two scenarios. One, the 1x CO2 is what is the sort of the size of the pools, if you will, at 280 parts per million CO2, and then if you doubled the CO2, what would happen? And you can see that these reactions increase in importance as CO2 concentrations double. The other thing that's important is that these carbonate and bicarbonate ions that are produced can mix with metal ions such as calcium and form calcium carbonate, which is either limestone or eggshells or the shells of the sea fish, clams, sort of thing. And that's a sequestration process that carbon again becomes sequestered. So inorganic carbon's an important component, but more in a geologic sense than really in a sort of an ecological sense that we deal with. When we're interested in carbon, we're dealing with what we would think of as organic carbon, which is carbon combined with other compounds, and really the whole driver of this is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the origin of all the organic carbon on the planet, and that's basically light and CO2 are combined in green plants to give us carbohydrates, C6H12O6 in various forms. That process gives off oxygen, And then those carbon compounds that are fixed can be used as an energy source through respiration, can become plant parts, can be stored in the soil. But ultimately, all of the carbon that we're dealing with in the carbon cycle in terrestrial systems that is not the inorganic carbonate forms is driven by CO2 fixed by photosynthesis. So we're a biological process that we're dealing with. If we think of kind of this carbon flow through forest ecosystems, we're kind of interested in again, this CO2 that fixes the carbon into the green plants. A portion of it is stored in those green plants. Some of that leaves the green plants and reaches the soil as litter fall. A portion of it leaves through the roots or through decomposing organic matter in the soil and reaches the soil as dissolved compounds. The antithesis, or the opposite process of photosynthesis, is respiration, and we have various components of respiration in forest ecosystems. All living organs respire, just like you and I do. When we breathe out, we're respiring, and so we're releasing CO2 back to the atmosphere, and so plants do that as well, both through the roots as well as through above ground portions. And we talk about that as autotrophic respiration, which is the living portion. So that's one component of total ecosystem respiration. The other component is the decomposition process, primarily in the forest floor and the soil, which is the decomposition of the organic matter fixed by photosynthesis into carbohydrates and more complex compounds, which the microbial population reacts to, decomposes, and the CO2 released during the decomposition process we talk about as heterotrophic respiration. And the combination of the autotrophic and the heterotrophic respiration is what we're really dealing with total ecosystem respiration, which is the return of the carbon back to the atmosphere. And so the balance of fixation and respiration really is net ecosystem carbon accumulation that we're interested in. What's important to understand, though, is that of the carbon that reaches the soil, only a portion of it is released through decomposition, and this heterotrophic decomposition, and some portion of it is remained in the soil and remains stable and accumulates in the soil as what we call soil organic matter, or through most of this presentation we'll be talking about SOM, or using the acronym SOM, which stands for soil organic matter, which is roughly synonymous with the carbon content in the soil. So the next slide is to talk a little bit just about those processes. And if we think about it, we have the most visible forms of carbon in most forest ecosystems are the above ground portions, so the trees, whether it's the loblolly pine on the left or yellow poplar, the carbon stored in the above ground component, or the carbon stored in the forest floor, such as a pine litter layer underneath loblolly pine, or a hardwood litter layer underneath a hardwood forest. And to most of us, these are the most visible forms of carbon stored in forest ecosystems. However, they tend to be what you might think of as a bit more ephemeral, in that the longevity of the carbon in those above ground components is much shorter than the residence time of carbon in the soil, and is much more there's much more potential to manipulate that through our activities on the forest. So the carbon stored in the above ground portion of a pine tree could be harvested and shipped to a mill. That material could be put into paper and then burned and returned back to the atmosphere very quickly. It could be sequestered into lumber and stored in a house for hundreds of years. That's the whole question of life cycle analysis that we'll deal with in this class as well. We can also manipulate the carbon in the forest floor. If we have fires or we disc the soil or we do a silvicultural treatment, we can accelerate decomposition or remove that material. So our management practices can have a pretty big impact on that above ground carbon pool, which has a residence time probably in hundreds of years is what we can probably think about of how long that carbon will last. And we can contrast that, to our soil components. And what we have recognized is that soils contain large amounts of carbon, and you can see it basically by the black color in a soil. So these surface horizons on the soil on the left or the surface horizon on the soil on the right contain relatively large amounts of carbon, as evidenced by the black color. The soil on the left is a spodosol, and it also contains subsurface accumulations of organic matter, as this black horizon kind of around the 1 foot mark in that soil. And so soils are accumulating carbon, and what we current theory tells us that residence time for that carbon in the soil is maybe an order of magnitude or more greater than the residence time of above ground. And so we're talking about thousands of years, maybe hundreds, thousands of years where the carbon could reside in the soil. And so it forms a much more permanent storage. So if we're thinking about altering carbon, the carbon cycle and sequestering carbon, sequestering it in the plant component, either the above ground component or the forest floor, is really not a very long-term solution. It might be a short-term solution on the order of decades or 100 years, a bit longer if we put it into products that have a longer life cycle or put it into a landfill that contains it for periods of time. But really it's the soil and the long-term residence time of organic matter in the soil that has a big impact on the carbon cycle, either positively if we can sequester more carbon into the soil, or in a negative way if we increase decomposition rates and respiration rates from the soil. We can actually have a big impact on loss of carbon. And in the paper by Schmidt, one of the things he talks about is the potential impact of thawing of frozen soils in the Arctic, and the potential to release carbon as those frozen soils thaw out, which could release huge amounts of carbon that's been sequestered. So it's both can be both a source and a sink of carbon. And so what I wanted to show you is just from this slide, and I think Dan's going to talk a little bit more about this, but the pools in major forest biomes and why soils are so important. So if we look at boreal forests or temperate forests or tropical forests, in all of these, we can look at where the pools of carbon are. And this table in slide 11 really shows us where the carbon is. So we get an idea of gross primary productivity, or really how much photosynthesis occurs in those in the first line. The second line is that autotrophic respiration, how much is lost. The difference between GPP and autotrophic respiration, or RA, is the net primary productivity. And then we have the autotrophic or heterotrophic respiration subtracted from that to give us net ecosystem productivity. So that's the amount of carbon fixed on an annual basis in those different ecosystems. You can then look at plant carbon and see how much of that carbon actually is in the plant component. And you can see it's maybe ranging from a low of in the low 70s for the boreal or temperate forests up to 400 picograms in the tropical forests. But take a look at the second to last line, and you can see the importance of soils again in in all ecosystems, the forested ecosystems, the boreal, the temperate, the tropical. The soil is storing 2, 3, 4 times as much carbon than the above ground plant component. And so the fact that these ecosystems are serving as sinks, much of it is because of how much carbon is stored in those soils. So let's think about soils just a little bit, and it's important. Maybe 3 times more than the atmosphere, maybe more than that. And just as an aside, those of you in Florida, I should give you a quiz on what this is on the left. Anybody know? Type in your thing and tell me what it is in your chat box or whatever. Give you extra credit if anybody knows. Happens to be Mayaca soil, which is the state soil of Florida. So, so anyway, so carbon. We're talking about soils being important, and there's really a very simple question that is brought forward in that Schmidt article as well. Is why does organic matter persist in soil? Because if we go to thermodynamics, it shouldn't. It's not stable. It should convert back to the atmosphere, and if it is not stabilized in some manner, it would all convert back to the atmosphere and turn back to CO2, which is the stable form thermodynamically of carbon in the systems. So why does organic matter persist in soil? And why do soils vary in the amount of organic matter that we have? We have some soils, such as the one here in picture 14 on the left, huge amounts of organic carbon in the surface, other soils with very little. And similar climatic conditions, similar rainfall temperature, and yet the soils vary very greatly in the carbon that they store. And those are important questions that we should address. And so, in a very, very simplistic manner, the carbon content in the soil is really the balance between the additions that we have and the decomposition rate. And so the additions of carbon from the above ground portion to the litter layer and how that moves into the soil, the release of carbon from plant roots, dead microbial bodies, dead snakes, dead ants, all the organic matter is the source. And then that material is decomposed. And if decomposition is slower than addition, carbon will build up. If addition is less than decomposition, carbon will decompose. And it is true that simple carbon compounds tend to decompose faster than more complex carbons. So, simple sugars decompose very quickly, cellulose a little bit slower, and complex compounds such as lignin decompose quite slowly, relatively slowly. And then there's other factors that come into play, such as the nitrogen content. And if you have a high C-to-N ratio, which means a lot of carbon and little nitrogen, decomposition rates might be slower. If you have more nitrogen and a little less carbon, the decomposition rates might be faster. And that's because the microbial organisms that do the decomposition, they need some nitrogen in order to survive as well. And so in general, that's what we understand about decomposition. And you can see this if you just look at decomposition rates that we see from various trees. If we add litter layer to the forest floor, a tree like a mulberry, if we were to measure that and collect the mulberry leaves and then weigh them after a year and how much was left, almost 90% might decompose in 1 year. Redbud, not quite as much, but still pretty fast. And things like white oak or loblolly pine, maybe only half the litter layer decomposes in the year, and the rest stays around. And that's controlled to a large extent by the lignin content of that material and the nitrogen content, as you can see on the left and the right. So those materials that have less of a lignin content will decompose quicker. Those that have a higher nitrogen content will decompose quicker. But if we think about it, all of the organic matter decomposition, it's an enzymatic process. And so it is a microbial-driven process that's mediated by enzymes. And so this little cartoon kind of shows what happens. And so you have an enzyme illustrated by the kind of squiggly line on box on the bottom with what's known as an activation site. And it's kind of like a lock and a key mechanism. The substrate that we're trying to decompose, such as complex organic matter, has to fit into that lock and key. And if it does, then the complex that's formed, the bond that's formed between the enzyme and the substrate, it actually weakens or reduces the amount of energy needed to break that compound apart. And chemically we call that weakening the activation energy or reducing the activation energy. But the net result is that at lower temperatures and with less energy input, that complex carbohydrate or organic matter is broken up into smaller pieces. Those are released and the enzyme is reformed. And that process goes on. And so that's what the microbes are doing, is producing the enzymes that are needed to decompose the material. And out of that process, they get energy. And so if we think of the classical view of organic matter and why it persists in soils, what we used to think is that there were these labile forms of organic matter, which are, labile simply means it's available to the microbes to decompose. And really what it means is it's accessible to these enzymes. So the enzymes can attach to the material, they can have these activation sites, they can reduce the activation energy, break the organic matter into pieces, and therefore break it down. And so if it's labile, it's really accessible to these enzymes. And things like sugar and cellulose, under this theory, are transformed into non-labile forms, such as what we think of as humic material, because through the decomposition process, the microbial organisms break these compounds down, utilize pieces for energy, and they leave recalcitrant pieces left in the system. And these recalcitrant pieces combine to form larger and larger and more complex molecules, which is humic material. And in this theory, what it means is that these large complex molecules become stable in the soil, and it's the property of the molecule or the organic matter itself that leads to stability, because as these large complex molecules, the enzymes no longer fit, and there's no more lock and key, and so the enzymes can't fit in to break the big compound apart. And so if you look at it, that process is kind of schematically illustrated here in that you have relatively simple compounds like cellulose. It's just basically a sugar hooked together. And that is decomposed by enzymatic processes, and the net result of what we used to talk about as these condensation reactions, and condensation simply means accumulating and building bigger molecules, leads to these large complex molecules such as humic acid. And that's illustrated on the bottom of slide 19. And as you can see there, it's simply more difficult for an enzyme to fit in and decompose some of these compounds. And that's the traditional thought. So we build up this humic acid, and that leads to the fact that these large complex molecules are present, means that its decomposition is retarded, and therefore it's stable in the soil, and that's how it builds up in the soil. And so if that theory is true, what it means is these large complex molecules, such as humic acid, should decompose slower than simpler compounds if they're released in the soil. And unfortunately, if we actually look at that process, and this is a figure that comes right out of that Schmidt paper where they asked that question, well, does humic acid or these large lignin-type molecules, do they decompose slower? Is it the physical property of that molecule that affects decomposition? So this little graph that they have in their paper shows the mean residence time of a whole variety of different molecules when they're added to the soil. And the third one down in the top box is lignin, which is essentially humic acid. And so if this material were more resistant, it should decompose slower, and its residence time should be much longer, such as the residence time of the bulk soil organic matter. And yet you can see its actual residence time in soil is not much different. And this led to the hypothesis that it's not simply the size of the molecule or the complexity of the molecule present in the soil that leads to decomposition differences, but it must be something else about the soil if bulk soil organic matter, such as the top, can have such a long residence time of hundreds or thousands of years. So that puts sort of a dent in our, if you would say, our traditional theory of what might happen. And the other thing that's really interesting is in that paper, if you look at figure 2 that I've reproduced here, it also shows how our theories can change based on new techniques that are available. And so historically, what we used were kind of chemical extractions. We'd take a bit of soil and we'd shake it up with some chemicals and we'd extract it and we'd analyze that and interpret the results based on what we got from these wet chemical observations. As techniques and modern science has evolved, we actually have new techniques where we can actually in situ image and examine individual molecules at the nanoscale. And when we look at soil organic matter under those new techniques, we found that much of the soil organic matter or soil carbon isn't in large complex molecules, but it's really, when we look at it, and we now have that ability, it's much simpler molecules. So that sort of lends credence to the previous question that it's not really these large macromolecules, but perhaps smaller molecules that are somehow stabilized in the soil. So let's think of that theory. And so under this revised theory, what we believe is that organic matter persists in soil is because it's not due to these large molecules, but it's the way that the organic matter or carbon interacts with the soil itself. And it's the soil properties that tend to determine how that organic matter is complexed and held or retained in the soil, and it's sort of physiochemical reactions. And so these physical-chemical reactions that slow decomposition might be a variety of different mechanisms. And we talk about low affinity soil organic matter mineral actions, where it's just an electrostatic reaction between a charged organic matter and a charged soil particle, kind of like a magnet holding metal. There may be other mechanisms such as covalent bonds, where the organic matter actually bonds with some of the soil particles. There's some other high affinity mineral interactions that are essentially much stronger magnets, if you think about that analogy. And then some of the organic matter is actually tied up internal to soil particles. In all of these mechanisms, what they really do is when there's an interaction between these organic molecules and the soil, the enzymes can't fit in that lock and key anymore. It's like someone squirting super glue into your key lock, and the enzyme and the key won't fit anymore. And if the enzyme key doesn't fit, decomposition is reduced. And under this theory, small as well as large molecules can be protected from decomposition by these enzymes. And under this theory, the organic matter retention, and its persistent, really depends more on the properties of the soil in combination with the organic matter than just the organic matter itself. And so things like clay content or clay mineralogy or the metals such as aluminum or iron that are found in soil have a large impact on the decomposition process and can essentially, through the organic matter interactions with these kinds of materials, can protect the organic matter and reduce its decomposition. And so if you look at, this is figure 3 or 4 from Schmidt, I should have labeled it, but this is the sort of the evolution of these theories. On the left you have this idea of these condensation reactions leading to stable compounds, which may still be a part of the reason, but really it's probably more likely that the processes on the right are more acting, and that there's this physical disconnection, if you will, between the enzyme and the molecules, and that's because these materials are absorbed onto different soil particles and they're no longer available to the microbial community in that context. And so what I've shown here is a graph from another paper, and if you're really interested in this, and I'm sure all of you are going to run out and get this paper, but there's a paper by Kanat in Global Change Biology that talks about this same thing, and it's talking about how do we stabilize organic matter in soils, and he's showing these various ways that available soil organic matter can be stabilized, and this is through these processes. So here's a soil particle, and this is organic matter that's basically held to the surface of the organic matter through low affinity bonds, basically just a very weak attraction. And as you go across that bottom of that graph, you can see the different mechanisms that he proposes that leads to stability. And if you go from left to right across that bottom portion of the graph, it becomes more and more protected. So that on the very right, you have what's known as occluded organic matter, which is organic matter trapped interior to soil particles that may be very stable within the system. And so all of this, I think, is important because of the implications that this have. And if we think about the predictions, and we're going to talk about in this class, the climate change scenarios are there, but most of them suggest atmospheric and global temperatures will rise. Well, under conventional chemical theory, which is based on, if you go back to your intro chemistry class, the Arrhenius equation, which talks about the activation energy needed to have a molecular reaction occur, and complex organic matter in the soil has high activation energies. And so in the Arrhenius equation, those reactions that have high activation energies, they require a lot of energy input to occur. As temperature goes up, those reactions would be more sensitive to temperature than reactions with low activation energies. And what this really tells us is if organic matter in the soil was simply these large complex molecules which have high activation energies, as temperatures go up, that the decomposition of these molecules would increase dramatically, and therefore the soil carbon would likely be reverted back pretty quickly to CO2 as it's thermodynamically stable. Under the revised theory, where it's saying it's not these large complex molecules, but it's the reactions that they undergo and how they complex in the soil, then as temperature changes, it's not a straightforward kind of kinetic question. It's really a physical-chemical bonding question in the soil and how that organic matter is protected, which means it's going to be a much more complex interaction between climate change, air temperatures, soil temperatures, and how this organic matter is going to decompose. And in fact, some of it that might be stabilized, such as the organic matter stabilized interior to soil particles, may be stable at very great temperatures. Certainly any biological temperature that we're dealing with. So that's why this is really important and why we need to understand that, because if we are going to predict how fluxes from the soil to the atmosphere are going to occur, we need to know how that organic matter is controlled and protected in the soil. So those people that are looking at microbial respiration or soil CO2 efflux, these questions become very relevant to us. So that's what I wanted to talk about with soil carbon in that. And so if there's questions, we can go through that, or maybe Dan wanted to talk now. So I think I turned.
So the McKinley paper, I was just going to start off by saying a little bit of our goals here. We do want all of you, you range in your interest from AIM 1 to AIM 6. Some of you are more economists than physical scientists. But we would like all of you to sort of have a fundamental understanding of the global and forest carbon cycles. And in terms of mitigation and adaptation, to think a little bit about trade-offs. And there was some online discussion where students were addressing the question about afforestation and planting trees, And where do we want to do that? Do we want to do that in grasslands? And so yes, there's ways to maybe sequester more carbon and mitigate responses to climate change, but they all have trade-offs. And whatever you're doing, you want to be cognizant of those trade-offs. So hopefully by the time we're done here, you'll be able to identify some sources and sinks and fluxes in these cycles, make diagrams, which you could do to various levels of detail, like Tom was talking about here with soil carbon. And then as we move up in scale from our image of the forest stand, to think about system boundaries. And of course, when you model things, these are always kind of questions: what are the boundaries of the system? There has been some terminology that's developed there, so we want you to be aware of that terminology and how it relates to things we might propose. And then as we think about these ideas of trade-offs, so anything that you might propose, you're cognizant of those potential trade-offs. Okay, and so McKinley and his group provide you a pretty broad walk through a lot of issues relating to forest carbon. It's a useful paper, kind of like the Schmidt paper, in providing citations to some older literature as well as a lot of current things on a whole range of different topics in this case. So as you move forward with your own research, you might turn to some of these review papers as a good place to get going. Okay, so like Tom noted, we deal with a lot of scales of metric units. In fact, I will tease Tom a little bit here, who kept using the word picogram, which of course is a very small scale. Really what we're talking about is petagrams, so 10 to the 15th grams, not 10 to the negative 12th grams. So just recognize when we're working in the lab, a lot of times we're talking about milligrams or micrograms, but when we start working at the forest or stand scale, we'll use megagrams or metric tons. And then, we go on up from there. When we start talking about the U.S. or the world, we're often talking about gigatons, which is really becomes really these tera or petagrams. Okay, so just sort of keep track of your units and get real good at manipulating exponential and scientific notation. Okay, so Tom talked to us a little bit about the global carbon budget. This is just a different image of it and a simplified one, where essentially we just have it's a three-box model. We have oceans, atmosphere, and the terrestrial environment. And this big box on the bottom is really part of the terrestrial environment. It is really those carbonate, a lot of that inorganic carbon that Tom mentioned. It is a very big pool, but it cycles rather slowly. Okay, and so we tend to be a little bit more stuck in the fluxes between this terrestrial and atmospheric environment. The other thing I would have you note is these emissions from fossil fuels. These emissions from fossil fuels are really actually, we have a lot of concern, but they're quite small relative to the ocean fluxes. So we're looking at 9 petagrams per year of carbon relative to 100 coming in and out of the oceans, or about 100, it's not quite 100, but about 100 coming in and out of the terrestrial environment. So although we're very concerned about this 9, realize that the fluxes in other parts of the cycle are really a fair bit larger. This other black line is really emissions from land use change, okay? And so it's really a small portion of the total emissions, of the total fluxes rather, that we're thinking about when we think about fossil fuel emissions. Okay. Okay. The other thing I would have you be aware of course, the system is not static. It is, of course, quite dynamic, and so the balance of where things are moving is actually changing. And so this is a little figure that I modified to use some older data from 1996. It was really published in Schlesinger's 1997 book on biogeochemistry. But what you notice, there's a couple of things, is that the fluxes, of course, the fossil fuel emissions, despite all our concerns and our efforts, has really gone up. And where that carbon has ended up is changing. So in 1996, not quite half of the carbon was staying in the atmosphere. The rest of it, a fair bit of it, was getting absorbed into the oceans, and some of it in secondary forest or forest growth being accumulated in the terrestrial environment. Okay, what you notice is if you move forward to the most recent data from 2010, a report that was published in 2011, you'll notice that more and more of the carbon is staying in the atmosphere. First of all, the emissions, of course, have gone up substantially from fossil fuel burning, and more of it is staying in the atmosphere, as it seems like the oceans are not able to take up a similar proportion. Okay, so the total amount they're taking up is increasing, but proportionally, bigger percent is accumulating in the atmosphere. Okay, so the system is clearly not static. It is a dynamic system, and it will continue to change. Okay, because of the effect of the scale of these emissions relative to some of the fluxes in the land and ocean, what we do on land clearly can matter to these budgets. Okay. So McKinley takes us from the global scale down to the forest scale, really thinking across the United States. So we're still working at a pretty large scale. He has table 4 in the manuscript. It's a little bit of a complex table because it includes a couple of different estimates. So he has one estimate just looking at net forest growth in the United States. And then he has a few other estimates that look at forest annual net carbon storage and change, and he includes wood, or harvest of wood, the change in the pool of carbon that is stored as wood in use. Okay, and so you might hear that term a little bit, wood in use, and that's really 2x4s that go into houses, maybe paper that is used and put in landfills that might have a long storage time. There was a question posted about this. It's usually done on a carbon basis when we think about the carbon that's stored in that wood, but it really isn't a product. It's in a wall of a house that got built in 2005 and might well stay in that wall to 2095. Okay, and so if we're building more and more buildings with wood and we're putting more and more wood into long-lived products, we can in fact store more carbon that way. Okay, and we do build a lot of houses, about 1 million housing starts a year in most normal years. Okay, from our side, the next thing that we're interested is, and a lot of us will focus on this forest carbon budget really at the stand scale or really across the southeast. But then we might start thinking about what we might do in terms of managing forests to mitigate accumulating CO2 in the atmosphere. And, a number of options are proposed. Things like afforestation, simply planting more trees to accumulate carbon, managing forests, trying to get a greater carbon density, growing trees faster, planting more trees per acre, accumulating more biomass on every acre of land that we manage. We might simply use forest production as a form of energy. Thank you. Yes, I think you're right. I was talking about table 1 in this case, not table 4, if you're following along in the manuscript. So if we could displace fossil fuel use by biomass energy use, and again, that might be a good way to mitigate some of the effects of fossil fuel burning and CO2 accumulation. And then the last thing is product substitution. Of course, we put a lot of energy into making things like steel beams. If you can use wood rather than steel, there's a couple of studies out there that suggest that would really be a very big energy savings, and you would emit a lot less fossil fuel and CO2 emissions if you were to substitute things like steel beams with wood products. Okay, and so in that table there have been a range of studies that have tried to look at what is that mitigation potential. And it ranges anywhere from very small, the units in the table there are actually teragrams of carbon, okay, and to quite large, up to 330 teragrams of carbon, maybe by an individual process or in some combination. And for the economists out there, of course, the table includes the effect of manipulating markets. If you were to provide subsidies for doing some of these things and value carbon, what would it cost to really influence a change in that system? Okay, and at the bottom there, all of these are relative to the total emissions being produced. So forests matter, but forests alone are not going to offset total CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. Okay, so really we're in the range of 10 to 20%, maybe a little bit more, that we could really impact or sequester potentially in some way through forest management. Okay, they do make a note, of course, in all these cases when we're thinking about substituting products or bioenergy. Of course, the forests that we live in and work in, and if you just moved in here, you live in them now, I guess. You know, the southern forests cover a very large extent. There's some figures in the paper, figure 5A and a figure 6. That's really just a bar chart. You know, the southeast is a very productive forest and a highly managed forest. And so these some 13 million hectares of southern forests in pine plantations are really highly managed, and that creates some opportunities for us in the sense that we're already on the ground manipulating these systems. And so if we're already busy managing them, we've changed management quite extensively over the last decades. People are certainly open to changing their management again, depending on things like markets and value of their products, and what we can actually do on the ground in a cost-effective way. Okay, so I just pulled this right out of the paper to make you well aware that the forest that you're working in can really play a substantial role here. Okay, let's jump down a level to the forest carbon budget. I'm not going to go back into some of the details that Tom covered, but encourage us to just think about expanding the model for our forest carbon budget. And so right on the right, we might consider how much fossil fuel are we putting into our management. And a couple of our colleagues, Tim Martin's group and myself, you know, we've put out some papers where we've looked at things like fossil fuel use. You know, how much does it cost to fertilize a stand in terms of fossil fuels? How much fossil fuel do you use to create herbicides, and how do you expend fossil fuels in terms of getting that product onto the ground, whether you're doing it through helicopters or fixed-wing aircraft or tractors or spreaders. And similarly during harvest, you know, how much energy do you really expend running skidders on a site or site preparing a site? Okay, and then on the left-hand side of that forest box there, this course is forest products, and they include landfills in terms of thinking about the end location or the final disposition for that product. Okay. And there was some questions about, you know, how good are some of these estimates? And, you know, within the forest stand, we know some pools pretty well. You know, things like growth rates, we know pretty well. You know, fossil fuels use for moving tractors or equipments around, we have some numbers on that. Things like decomposition in landfills, of course, we don't know those numbers very well. Okay. So there's a range of ways that you can enter the carbon budget depending on the boundary. Are you simply interested in forest management, what we do as land managers, or are you interested a little bit more in kind of widening your boundaries to include something of the products that are being produced from wood. Okay. So again, as we're looking at the system, I won't really go over this very much, but of course a lot of us in AIM 1 and AIM 2, and maybe if you're a geneticist in AIM 3, thinking about are you going to grow more roots or leaves or branches, we budget carbon in the forest stand a lot. We want to know where it is. Is it above ground or below ground? And then of course we're also interested in the fluxes in and out of that system. And so our ecophys group will spend a little bit of time measuring plant respiration, and many of us will measure soil respiration. And of course, we're interested at rates of photosynthesis. Okay, and so we could do this in a lot of different ways at the forest stand level. Okay, one thing we didn't talk about earlier on is thinking about how harvest or other disturbance, particularly under changing climates, if you have more pests or if you have more fire, how those disturbances will impact some of these carbon pools and fluxes. And of course, in the case that Tom was discussing, you know, when you harvest the forest stand, what happens to that soil carbon? Does it simply continue to accumulate? Does it just stay in the ground? What percentage is well protected? You know, that dead wood that Tim mentioned, so not just in forest floor, when I lay a lot of slash on the ground during harvest, what happens to that slash? You know, Tom suggested that most of it just ends up back in the atmosphere. If that's true, how quickly does that happen? And could we manipulate the system in some way to not let it go back into the atmosphere? Or might we potentially make use of that slash for bioenergy production? And of course, some of that is already done in some cases. Okay, so we can think about that in terms of harvest disturbance, or we could think about that in terms of natural disturbance, increasing pests, increasing fire, potentially increasing drought and mortality through drought. So there's a lot of things that might impact what happens to these particular pools over time. Okay. And of course, you mentioned those studying genetics, you know, if it's true that root carbon actually stays in the soil, well, then maybe we would plant different genetic stocks of trees to try and increase that soil pool. Okay, so here's really just a diagram to think about expanding that carbon budget. The trees on the left are really, you know, that biological side, things that we look at very intensively in AIM 1 and 2 and AIM 3, but also starting to think about the industrial side. What happens to that roundwood? How much of the roundwood is re-emitted as CO2? Are there other manufacturing processes that maybe potentially emit other greenhouse gases? So what's really the final fate of that carbon that comes out of the forest, and how long does it really stay as carbon sequestered, and how quickly does it actually return back to the atmospheric cycle? And of course, many of us don't really, we know we go visit mills and sawmills and paper mills once in a while, but we don't work directly with these processes. We tend to be over here in sort of this biological side. But of course, part of our goal in this project is to think about both those sides and how we might really present a system of carbon management that's not just on the ground. Okay, so there's a couple of terms here I'd like to cover. I don't want to keep talking at you too long. So there's just 3 more slides, but they have a lot of terms in them. You know, one case in terms of sequestering carbon, of course, there's been a lot of interest in simply managing forests in some way to accumulate carbon. Of course, forests are very good at this. They photosynthesize, they store stem wood, and so they sequester carbon quite well. So there has been some markets that have developed globally. There have been people that have actually sold carbon offsets. In the state of California in the U.S. that has their own state emission caps. There is also RGGI in the Northeast. There are some regional systems of CO2 caps. Within both of those systems, they've provided some ability to offset carbon through managing forests. I'm not aware of any systems in the Southeast. In the state of Georgia, we did develop a carbon registry, but there's no regulatory mechanism, and so virtually no money has changed hands. But in this system of carbon offsets, there's been a lot of interesting discussion about, well, should people just get paid for doing what they already do, or do they have to do something different, i.e., is there some kind of additionality? Are they taking some specific action to sequester carbon beyond their existing activities? And there have been some different models how to do this with different kinds of baselines. Do you start with just a stagnant fixed point and anything beyond that? Or do I recognize that the forest was going to grow on its own, so I'm going to grow the baseline over time, and only things that I do that exceed that natural rate of growth I would get paid for? Okay, and so additionality is a pretty important concept. Are we going to do different things in the forest that we manage? The notion of permanence just relates to, of course, we would like to sequester this carbon from the atmosphere for a long time or forever. Some people argue, no, maybe we only want to do it for 20 or 30 years to give us an opportunity to develop more clean fossil fuel technologies, whether they be renewable fuels or CO2 capture in some way. So in contracts that have been written to sell forest carbon offsets, there have been different levels of permanence. In the California system, I think they require 100 years. Most of the lands, the few cases where lands have been sold, there's been some kind of conservation easement for I believe 100 years. Okay, and these are important issues because fire, disturbance, pests, those are not things we can really control. So from the market and economic side, there has been some work looking at how we can ensure these markets against things like fire or unexpected disturbance. And of course, as land changes hands, a new landowner might simply choose to harvest that property. Okay, and then the last thing that you should be a little bit aware of is the notion of leakage, that if I propose to do something in my forest, it might in fact have an effect on another forest. And of course, the simple case here is conservation of lands in the U.S. Okay, we're not going to cut forests here. We're going to let carbon accumulate. Well, if all that does is lead to greater harvest somewhere else, be it in the Pacific Northwest or up in Canada or in the tropics, then really from a larger perspective, we really haven't done anything in terms of reducing CO2 in the atmosphere. So this notion of leakage is discussed regularly in terms of whatever actions we're considering. Okay, so try and make yourself aware of some of this terminology that is used in terms of carbon forest offset projects. Okay, finally here, this is really my last figure or slide relating to the article. You know, there is, I guess in this case, table 2. Let's be sure I get that right. This is sort of towards the end of the article on page 1916. You know, there's a lot of things we can do to increase stocks of forest carbon or mitigate types of mitigation actions. But all of those have trade-offs, and so I mentioned the brief discussion that was going on the discussion board. You know, there are probably places that we can plant trees, like the state of Minnesota was suggested. Areas of Minnesota that are kind of grasslands now could probably be planted into trees, but of course there's a trade-off there. You're going to lose whatever other land uses that are ongoing currently. The McKinley article talks about agricultural land. Some of you are probably aware of the Conservation Reserve Program that paid farmers to take marginal agricultural land out of production for corn or an agricultural crop and put it into trees. That was quite a successful program, but of course that reduced the number of acres being farmed for a particular crop, and so you would lose production of that crop. Okay, similarly, things like we do, like increasing rotation length, increasing forest growth, there's trade-offs to them. If we increase rotation length, we simply might have less wood to meet demand for a time, which might affect price. If we're increasing forest growth through fertilizer use, we need to be sure we're managing that fertilizer well and we're not impacting other processes, things like water quality. Okay, so each of these clearly has a lot of trade-offs. We would like to think a lot of them are issues that require an interaction, a social discourse. They are societal decisions, but we would hope that as scientists, as a community of scientists in the Southeast, we could bring some information to the table to help inform those decisions. Is really increased use of fertilizer a great threat, or is that trade-off really quite acceptable because we can manage that trade-off quite well? And so I think that's sort of our role, to bring essentially some scientific or quantitative information to help inform some of those societal decisions. And they're not very easy decisions, and a lot of people want to get paid for doing different things, and so how do we manipulate markets to incentivize people? A lot of things that are well beyond my purview of expertise and the things I actually study. Okay, and so hopefully we will, over the course of this class, hear from people that do study those things, and learn a little bit more about the details along the lines of details that Tom was giving us about things that are much closer to what I study. Okay. Okay, and so I just remind you here of the goals of PINEMAP at the end, so that you might think about how these relate to the work of McKinley. Our goal is to create and disseminate knowledge about a lot of things, but as they really relate to pine forests throughout the Southeast, how we use that productivity to potentially mitigate atmospheric CO2, how we are efficient in our use of things like fertilizers if we're going to use them. And then we haven't really talked a whole lot about sort of these adaptation ideas, and that's a little bit here what Randy will talk about. How do we really adapt to a changing climate, maybe in all forests in the Southeast, not just pine plantations that we're managing intensively.
Okay, well, I drew the short straw to talk about a paper that none of the three of us actually suggested for this session, but it turns out to be an interesting one. I'm hopeful everyone can hear me. Can I see a couple green checks if people can? Excellent. Okay, very good. So this paper is by a scientist from the Forest Service along with a colleague from USGS and UC Berkeley. And basically the idea is that we don't really know what's going to happen with respect to climate change. We have some certainty that global temperatures will rise in the aggregate. We have much less certainty about how much where, and as we move to precip regimes, it becomes much more complicated even than that. So we're really attempting to manage our ecosystems in the context of something that's quite uncertain. And this is why this paper, I think, has received a fair bit of scrutiny. There are a lot of citations. It's up at, even though it's been published for 3 or 4 years, there are 300 or 400 citations already of the paper. So it's a really good one for us to think about discussing. Now, it separates into 2 broad categories, which are very relevant for PINEMAP, adaptation and mitigation. We're going to focus primarily on the first and look at 3 important concepts that they bring up: resistance, resilience, and response. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump right into that and start to define them and give some examples as they indicate in the paper. Now, resistance, as they define it, is to forestall impacts and protect highly valued resources. Now, this almost definitionally is a very short-term kind of an activity. Okay, so things we might do, for example, might be fuel breaks, thinning, or other fuel reduction. We might have prescribed burns, and in some instances, while that is a bit of a longer-term kind of an activity, resistance breeding. The bottom line, though, is that these are for extant, pretty highly valued resources for which additional management that could forestall the impacts of climate change is reasonable. For a long-term strategy, of course, it's not such a good strategy, and it's not even the one that's primarily embraced by PINEMAP with respect to the original proposal verbiage, which was in fact resilience. So I'm going to move on and talk about resilience, and this is it's a topic I recall really spending a lot of time on in terms of ecosystem modeling in graduate school, and it's the idea of improving the capacity of ecosystems to return to desired conditions after disturbance. So the idea is that you're going to hopefully return to some state that's desired, okay? And you as a manager are trying to improve that return, okay? You might improve the state to which it returns, but more importantly, you might change the timing, make it happen a lot quicker. And so there are some examples that are given within the Miller paper: surplus seed banking, the management post-establishment that becomes more intensive, and then once again thinning and prescribed burning. There are some other things too that increasingly are done in a variety of ecosystems. One of these is to increase the structural diversity, and that can be both with respect to species and with respect to age class, and we'll talk a little bit more about those as we get to the response items as well. You can also do things to promote genetic adaptation. Okay, so this is really important for us as we think about how we can involve management and improvement in our management systems in the context of what we are learning increasingly about climate change and about our adaptive systems, as Tom mentioned earlier. So if we move on into response, this is the one where in this particular paper, the authors really put a lot of effort and really tend to draw the reader into this concept that with respect to adaptation, that response is really preferred over the other two that I just talked about. They define responses as a way to facilitate the transition of ecosystems from current to new conditions. Okay, so the idea is that you're going to end up with some new condition that is in fact going to be different, but different in an unknown way. Okay, you might have some understanding of the sign of the change, but not its magnitude. So there are several examples that they give for this, and they're mostly pretty good ones and ones that have some pertinence to our particular efforts here in the Southeast. One is to assist natural transitions and adaptations. Okay, so one of the possibilities in that instance might be in areas where we might have an ecotonal boundary, for example, we might have two species that are planted. This could be everything along an elevational gradient or along some sort of climatological gradient. So we might have multiple species that are planted simultaneously along that gradient, so that if there is basically a climatological control on the area in which a particular species can be viable, that we, as that ecotonal boundary actually shifts, that we're ready for it. So these are the kinds of things that, again, are response-based adaptations. There are a number of others that are mentioned, and one of these is this idea of increasing redundancy in buffers. It's very related to the prior one, but we do, of course, have natural ecosystem and biome boundaries. And as we start to think about a really substantial shift in climate, I mean, if we truly move to a 4-degree warmer world, those biome and ecosystem boundaries will be distinctly different. So we're not just talking about species shifts within a given biome in some instances. In some other instances, we're saying, well, you know, the boreal forest might not extend quite so far south, and our tropical forests may extend much farther north. And so we have to think very carefully about that as we plant and as we manage post-establishment. The next that they talk about with respect to responses, and this is a really interesting one, is if we think about the provenance that, you know, in terms of the way in which we're producing growing stock at this particular juncture, we're assuming that we have a relatively constant climatological and adaptive context from which we can manage for a desired characteristic. In most instances, that would be stem volume or wood quality. And so as we start to think about where climate will move us, in other words, where these existing particularly well-adapted trees are currently and where they might be, then we really have to say, you can't just assume that the given provenance is a reasonable boundary or area in which we can plant some of these things. And so this is very, very important. And again, front and center, if we think about how PINEMAP was structured in terms of the aims, we're really quite cognizant within the project as a whole. You'll hear more about that in this class, that the genomics and the way in which we breed and decide on where best to place a particular clone and the like are very, very important decisions for us. Another thing that they bring up with respect to response is that, and I talked a little bit about this earlier, but it becomes extremely important as we really don't know what's going to happen. And this gets into the serial stage of forest regrowth in particular. And if we think about a kind of a typical succession process, if we're changing the climate, we may not want that to proceed synchronously in its usual way. And this is, I think, one of the more interesting, from an ecological standpoint, an extremely interesting concept within the paper. So if you don't really know what's going to happen, okay, it's really hard to manage in the kind of typical way with a almost a monospecific successional idea in mind. And so the way in which we would manage for asynchrony, which is the way they phrase it, is to say, you know what, we've got to have within an individual stand, and very particularly across the landscape, as I mentioned earlier, some diversity with respect to species, age classes, and writ broadly the idea of genetic diversity. And so, this is kind of an interesting concept because, especially within what amounts to a pine monoculture in much of our area, because what we have is an area that is the natural range of loblolly pine, and so much of what we're managing for would be particular local adaptations to climate and soils. And so how we manage for asynchrony in this particular system, I think, is an interesting question for the project to start to think about. Another one of the response ideas is this establishment of neo-native forests. Okay, and this is the idea, and in particular, this is a radiotic cone, but in particular, the idea is that you may have had in the past, in the growing range of a species, you could have had past climatological conditions that actually allowed it to thrive. And you could actually go back and say, well, you know what, it used to be native here if you look at a particular epoch in time. And so there are examples, for example, right now, even in California, where the Monterey pine, the radiotic pine, is actually being reintroduced in areas where at one point it had been native, but it certainly is no longer. And it really just depends on the time scale at which you're looking. So another option that presented in the Miller paper, and I know we're kind of running a little bit low on time, but this is an important one, and one that's particularly difficult to address in the southeast when we have primarily 75 to 80% private ownership of our forests. But the idea of a migration of species or particular adaptations within species into new climatological regimes is quite facilitated if there's some way for that to happen. And the more connected the landscape, given what we know about seed dispersal, for example, the easier that is. The easier that can happen. The problem is, of course, that if you have primarily private ownership, that this becomes a much more delicate sort of a situation to try to manage publicly. It's a little bit easier in the West, and many of the examples have been introduced out there. Now, one thing that I did want to move forward with is this next idea in the Miller paper, which is that instead of what we think of as restoration, that we also have the idea of alignment. I do see your hand up. Just one second. I'll come right back to you. And this idea, and this is a Mono Lake example in California, is that instead of restoring, for example, this lake to its original boundaries, that we might say it's never going to have the same amount of water in it, and we start to manage for the new conditions. So this, instead of ecological restoration, we start to say, let's realign our ecosystems to the new condition. I'm going to stop for a minute. I have a hand raised, and it looks like I'll pass that on.
Hi. I also posted this in the chat box, but I was just wondering if you could explain the figure on the last slide a little bit more, please.
Last slide, this is a computer simulation, and what the basic idea is that we can start to simulate what we know about our mechanisms for migration of species given climate change. And one of the things that's quite interesting is that most models will assume that climate change is at a time scale where typical dispersal mechanisms will be sufficient in, with a few kind of remnant natural, quasi-natural, less intensively managed systems that we have. That starts to become more problematic in the way that we have managed forests more intensively. It also becomes more problematic as we have a much more fragmented, less connected landscape. And so this is just one of many possible model runs that show a little bit of what-if scenarios with respect to dispersal. I could get more into it, but I'm running really low on time, so I hope that's okay. All right, so I'm going to proceed here 2 slides forward. And this is a tough one, and one that I've re-paraphrased from the original article, which is the idea that if you're managing in the face of uncertainty, the kind of core question that you have to ask yourself is, what is the uncertainty? And to some extent, we have to expect the unexpected. And the kinds of things that we truly have the hardest trouble understanding will be the things where we start to have complex emergent properties of these systems. We start to have an increase in drought in seasons that we normally would not get them, that might lead to increased pests or fire, for example, or a change in the way, how well a particular species is adapted within the ecosystem or community in which it resides. So these are very complicated problems, and probably the hardest for us to think about in terms of management. Okay, I'm running a little bit low on time, but I will bring up a couple more of the issues that that did arise in the paper. One of this is that, of course, we do know that in previous glaciation events that we had a number of refugia. In most instances, these were areas that had their own climatological gradients. Most of them were montane systems, and we had places where, because of that heterogeneity in both climate, rainfall, in many cases the resulting soils, that we have a lot of biodiversity, and we had the potential for species reestablishment post-disturbance. If we consider climate change as itself a disturbance, there is, of course, the possibility to seed these man-made refugia, if you will, or to understand more about the ones that have been used in prehistoric past in terms of ecosystems. Moving very quickly out of adaptation into mitigation, this was covered very well by Dan, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I think the main thing that we do want to recognize is that with respect to mitigation, we really only have a couple options. One of these is to sequester more carbon, and the other is to reduce emissions, and fewer fires and pests were mentioned by Dan. We also have, of course, the carbon cost of management. That is another possibility, as well as changing how we emit. In other words, we could use the forests themselves as biofuels rather than using prehistoric forests as biofuels in the case of fossil fuels. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that and move forward into this concept of managing under uncertainty and to kind of revisit an old term of adaptive monitoring, but with a somewhat newer concept of adaptive management with a somewhat newer concept of adaptive monitoring. In a sense, we don't know what's going to happen, so we have to be kind of constantly in the midst of kind of adapting to conditions as they emerge, with hopefully enough research in the context of projects like this that will be able to be quickly change what we monitor if we start to see warning signs, and ultimately how we might manage as we start to see much more complicated, kind of emergent, unexpected activities occur. So with that, I'm right at the end of my presentation at the appointed hour, and certainly am able to take any questions or turn it back over to my other two colleagues for other questions that might have emerged.
For those of you that posted questions on the online discussion board, if you feel that your question has not been addressed and you want to repose that, please go ahead and do so now.
Okay, I'm going to address this question about connectivity that came up. Certainly connectivity could allow exotic species to migrate more easily as well, and the same is true with pests. And so you definitely have a two-edged sword in that context. And the exotics, that's a whole separate discussion that I guess I'm unwilling to enter into at this particular juncture. Maybe two of my other two colleagues would be interested. That it brings up a whole bunch of other issues. But yes, there's no doubt that for many of our pests that have very short migration routes that have to really ultimately go tree to tree, stand to stand, that increases in connectivity can really be a problem and might exacerbate the effects of climate change. Dan, you want to answer that one?
That is the threat of... I guess that is the threat of posing it, huh? No, I don't want to answer it. I'm not sure which student posed it, but I think it is a good question and a difficult one. And so maybe others have better ideas. I don't really know the answer there. And there's been a lot of discussion about adaptive management. But